What Clint Eastwood discovered in the 47th minute of trying to pray for 1 hour straight wasn't what he expected to find. It wasn't peace. It wasn't enlightenment. It wasn't the warm spiritual glow that prayer warriors talk about in testimonies. It wasn't even particularly comforting. What he found alone in his study at 3 a.m. was the one question he'd been afraid to ask God his entire life. The question he'd buried under decades of work and achievement and carefully constructed faith. The question that once asked would require an answer he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. And God answered, not in the way Clint expected, not in words or visions or burning bushes, but in a silence so profound, so complete, so pregnant with meaning that it shattered everything he thought he knew about prayer. The 1 hour prayer rule had seemed simple when his grandson suggested it. Pray for 1 hour without interruption, no distractions, no agenda, just presence. But what happened in that hour didn't just change how Clint prayed. It changed how he understood God, how he understood himself, how he understood the difference between talking to God and actually hearing from him.
This is the story of what happened when a 94-year-old man who'd spent his life talking finally learned to listen, and what God said when he finally stopped speaking long enough to hear.
The suggestion came 3 weeks earlier during what should have been an ordinary dinner. Clint Eastwood had prayed before. Of course he had. Grace before meals when he remembered. Quick appeals before flights. Desperate bargaining in hospital waiting rooms. The standard prayers of a man who believed but didn't necessarily practice with discipline. His grandson, Marcus, the same one who'd invited him to the wedding years before, had developed what some in the family called an intense faith. The kind that made him uncomfortable at parties where people drank too much. The kind that had him reading theology books for pleasure. The kind that, frankly, Clint didn't entirely understand but respected nonetheless. Over dinner at Clint's ranch, Marcus had mentioned his prayer routine. "I do an hour every morning," he said casually, cutting his steak. Changed everything. Clint raised an eyebrow. "An hour? Every morning? What do you even pray about for that long?" Marcus smiled. That knowing smile of someone who's discovered something profound but knows explaining it won't do it justice. "That's what I thought too before I tried it. I thought I'd run out of things to say in 10 minutes. But here's the thing, Grandpa. Prayer isn't really about saying things. That's just how it starts." "What's it about then?"
Listening.
The word hung in the air between them. Clint had heard sermons about listening to God, had nodded along to teachings about quiet time and hearing the still small voice. But he'd always assumed that was metaphorical, or for other people more naturally spiritual, more mystically inclined. "You should try it," Marcus challenged. 1 hour, no phone, no distractions, just you and God, see what happens. Clint had laughed it off. At 94, he'd long ago established his relationship with God. It worked fine as it was. Why complicate it? But the challenge lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. 1 hour, could he even sit still for an hour without doing anything? More pressingly, if he tried to pray for an hour, what would he say? What would happen when he ran out of words? And underneath that, barely acknowledged, what if he tried and nothing happened? What if an hour of prayer revealed that the connection he'd assumed was there actually wasn't? 3 days later at 3 a.m., unable to sleep, Clint decided to find out. He chose his study. Door closed. Phone off, just the lamp on his desk, and the silence. Clint had set a timer for 60 minutes, placed it face down so he wouldn't be tempted to check it, settled into his chair, and begun. God. He started, his voice sounding strange in the pre-dawn quiet. "I'm here, for an hour. Like Marcus suggested, I'm not entirely sure what I'm supposed to do, but here I am." The first 5 minutes were surprisingly easy. He thanked God for things. His health considering his age, his family, his career, the ranch, the sunset he'd seen yesterday. Gratitude came naturally, required little thought. Minutes 6 through 10, he prayed for people. Marcus and his wife, his other grandchildren, his children, friends who were sick, the flight attendant from that plane incident years ago. What was her name? Sarah. He prayed for Sarah, wherever she was. By minute 12, he was running low on conventional prayers, so he started confessing things, old resentments he'd never quite released, Pride about his accomplishments that he knew was excessive. Times he'd been less than kind when he could have chosen differently. The standard inventory of minor sins that accumulate over decades. Minute 15 arrived, and Clint hit a wall. He'd said everything he could think to say, had covered all the bases, had done what he understood prayer to be, talking to God about stuff. Now what? He sat in the silence, feeling foolish. This was exactly what he'd feared. Running out of things to say, the awkward emptiness of a one-sided conversation, when your material runs dry. But Marcus had said prayer was about listening. So Clint tried to listen, waited for God to, what? Speak, send a thought, provide a sign. Nothing came. Just silence. The tick of the clock, the faint sound of wind outside, his own breathing, more silence. And then, somewhere around minute 23, something shifted. The shift wasn't dramatic, wasn't supernatural, but it was undeniable. The silence began to feel less empty and more full, as if it had texture, weight, as if the absence of sound was actually the presence of something he'd never noticed before. Clint found himself becoming aware of his own mental noise, the constant stream of thoughts that normally occupied his mind, but that he usually ignored because he was busy doing things, saying things, thinking about things. Random memories surfacing. His father's face, a film set from 40 years ago. Something his mother said when he was 12. Anxieties about mortality. Pride about achievements. Worries about family members. Plans for tomorrow. Regrets about yesterday. The thoughts cascaded like a waterfall, and for the first time in his life, Clint sat still enough to really notice them, to see how rarely he was actually present, how constantly his mind was somewhere else, past or future, never fully now. And underneath all that noise, he began to sense something else. Not a voice exactly, not words, but a question forming in the space between his thoughts. A question that seemed to come from outside himself, even though it was arising within his own consciousness. The question was simple, terrifying in its simplicity. What are you afraid of? Clint's first instinct was to dismiss it. He wasn't afraid. He was 94. He'd faced down plenty in life. He'd made peace with mortality. What was there to be afraid of? But the question persisted, gentle but insistent. What are you afraid of? And as he sat with it, as he let himself actually consider it instead of reflexively denying it, images began to surface, memories, patterns, truths he'd been avoiding. He saw himself at 8 years old, desperate for his father's approval. Saw himself at 20, afraid of failure. At 30, afraid of never making it. At 50, afraid of losing what he'd built. At 70, afraid of becoming irrelevant. The fear had changed costumes, but never left. It had driven him, motivated him, pushed him to achieve. But it had also isolated him, kept him performing, made him measure his worth by his accomplishments, rather than by his existence. 94 years old, and he was still afraid, still trying to prove something, still earning his right to take up space in the world. What are you afraid of? And then the real answer came, the one he'd been avoiding. He was afraid that if he stopped achieving, stopped performing, stopped being impressive, he would discover that underneath all of it, he was nobody, that his identity was entirely constructed from external validation, that without the career and the acclaim and the legacy, there was no solid self underneath, just emptiness. The revelation should have devastated him. But something unexpected happened. As Clint sat with this uncomfortable truth, this fear of being nobody, something extraordinary occurred. The question that had emerged from the silence was followed by something else. Not words exactly, but a communication nonetheless. A knowing, an understanding that arrived fully formed, as if downloaded directly into his consciousness. The knowing said, you've always been somebody. Before you achieved anything, before you proved anything, before you impressed anyone, you were somebody when you were born. You were somebody when you were 8 years old and your father wasn't paying attention. You were somebody during all those failed auditions. You've never been nobody. You've just been convinced that being somebody required earning it. Tears came then. Unexpected, unbidden. Not sad tears, not happy tears. Something else. The tears of recognition, of truth acknowledged, of a lifetime of striving suddenly revealed as unnecessary. Not wrong, but unnecessary. He'd been running a race he'd already won, had been earning a love already given, had been building an identity that already existed. The silence in the room had transformed completely. What had started as empty awkwardness had become sacred space. The absence of sound wasn't void. It was the canvas on which divine communication was occurring. God wasn't speaking in words because words would be too limiting. The truth being conveyed was too big for language, too encompassing for sentences. Clint glanced at the timer. 38 minutes. He'd been sitting here for 38 minutes, and only now was the real prayer beginning. Everything before, the gratitude, the petitions, the confessions, that had been preamble. Necessary, perhaps, but not the point. This was the point, this sitting in presence, this allowing God to ask the questions Clint was afraid to ask himself, this receiving truth that could only be received in silence. And then God asked another question. The second question was even more terrifying than the first. Why do you pray? Clint almost laughed. He was literally sitting here praying, trying to pray for an hour, and God was asking why he prays. But as he sat with the question, he realized it wasn't rhetorical. It was diagnostic, probing. Why did he pray? The surface answers came first. Because he believed, because it's what Christians do, because he wanted to be a good example to his grandchildren, because prayer is how you maintain relationship with God. But underneath those answers, other motivations surfaced, less admirable ones. He prayed to feel like he was doing something spiritual, to check a box, to have a testimony, to feel less guilty about all the times he didn't pray, to convince himself he was a person of faith despite evidence to the contrary. He prayed transactionally, asking for things, trying to influence outcomes, bargaining, God, if you do this, I'll do that. As if prayer was negotiation, as if God was a cosmic vending machine that required the right combination of pleading and piety to dispense blessings. He prayed defensively, trying to protect himself from cosmic punishment, trying to stay on God's good side, trying to build up spiritual credit for when he really needed it. He prayed superstitiously, as if saying the words had power regardless of the heart behind them, as if the act of praying mattered more than the posture of praying. Why do you pray? The question dismantled every motivation he'd ever had, revealed them as something other than genuine connection, something other than authentic relationship, something other than what prayer was supposed to be. And then came the answer, or rather the realization, he'd been praying at God, not with God. Had been using prayer as a monologue rather than entering into dialogue, had been doing all the talking and calling it relationship. Real prayer, he suddenly understood, wasn't about the words he said. It was about the presence he entered. It was about showing up, being honest. And then this was the part he'd been missing his entire life, being quiet long enough to receive, instead of just transmit. He'd thought prayer was him reaching up to God, but it was actually God reaching down to him. And he'd been so busy talking, so busy presenting his case, so busy managing the interaction, that he'd never created space for God to actually communicate. Marcus had tried to tell him prayer is about listening, but Clint hadn't understood. You can't understand it till you experience it, until you sit in the silence long enough for your own noise to quiet, until you stop performing and start receiving. And then in minute 47 came the revelation that changed everything. The timer showed 13 minutes left. Clint had been sitting in prayer, real prayer, he now understood, for 47 minutes. And in that 47th minute, something happened that he would spend the rest of his life trying to find words for. It wasn't a vision, wasn't a voice, wasn't a burning bush or an angelic visitation. It was something more subtle and more profound. It was a shift in understanding, so complete that it felt like waking up from a dream he hadn't known he was having. The shift was this. He suddenly perceived, not thought, not believed, but perceived that God had been speaking to him his entire life, every moment of his 94 years. Not in words, not in dramatic revelations, but in the fabric of existence itself, in the beauty of a sunset that stopped him mid-step, in the unexpected kindness of strangers, in the ache of love for his children, in the grief of loss that broke him open, in the satisfaction of work well done, in the comfort of friendship, in the mystery of consciousness itself. The fact that he existed, was aware of existing, was aware of being aware. All of it was God speaking, every moment, every breath, every experience. The entire universe was God's language, and Clint had spent 94 years learning only the most elementary vocabulary. He'd been looking for God in special moments in church services and prayer meetings and powerful experiences when God had been present in every moment, sacred and mundane, spectacular and ordinary. The prayer times and the non-prayer times. God wasn't more present when Clint was praying than when he was eating breakfast. Wasn't closer during worship than during work. Wasn't speaking only in silence, but also in noise. Not only in peace, but also in chaos. The 1 hour prayer hadn't made God more present. It had made God more present. It had made Clint more aware of the presence that had always been there. And with that understanding came another. He'd been praying wrong his entire life. Not wrong in the sense of incorrect, but wrong in the sense of incomplete. He'd been treating prayer as an activity, something he did rather than a state of being, something he entered. Real prayer, he now understood, wasn't 60 minutes in his study at 3 a.m. Real prayer was living every moment with awareness of the presence that permeated everything. It was waking up, paying attention, noticing, being present to the presence. The 1 hour discipline wasn't the point. It was training, a way to develop the muscle of awareness so it could be exercised constantly. Marcus hadn't given him a rule to follow. He'd given him a tool for awakening. The timer buzzed. 60 minutes. But Clint didn't move. The buzzing of the timer seemed to come from very far away. Clint looked at it but didn't reach for it. Didn't end the prayer because he'd finally understood. You don't end prayer. You just become aware that you've started it. He sat for another 20 minutes. Not because he was disciplined. Not because he was trying to impress God or himself, but because he didn't want to leave. Because he'd finally found what he'd been searching for his whole life without knowing he was searching for it. Presence. Simple presence. With God, with himself, with reality as it actually was rather than as he'd constructed it to be. When he finally stood, his legs stiff from sitting so long, the world looked different. Same study, same furniture, same pre-dawn darkness outside, but different, more vivid, more real, more sacred. He understood now why Marcus did this every morning. Not as an obligation, not as a spiritual discipline in the eat your vegetables sense, but because once you've tasted real presence, everything else feels like shadow. Once you've experienced prayer as communion rather than communication, you don't want to go back to just talking at God. The sun began to rise as Clint made coffee, and he found himself praying while making coffee, not saying words, not asking for things, just being aware, noticing the weight of the coffee pot, the sound of water pouring, the smell of grounds, the miracle of morning, the gift of being alive, the presence of God in the absolute ordinary. Later that morning, Marcus called. "How'd it go?" he asked. "I don't know how to explain it," Clint said, and then tried anyway. Told him about the silence becoming full, about the questions that emerged, about the fear exposed, and the truth revealed, about realizing he'd been praying at God instead of with God, about the understanding that arrived in minute 47. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then, yeah, that's it. That's what I wanted you to find, not from me telling you had to experience it yourself. Why didn't you just tell me what would happen? Would you have believed me? Would you have understood? No, Clint wouldn't have. You can't understand it until you experience it. Can't explain it to someone who hasn't sat in that silence long enough for their own noise to quiet. "So what now?" Clint asked. "I can't do an hour every day. I don't have the discipline." "You don't need an hour," Marcus said. "You just need awareness." The hour was training wheels. Now you know what you're training for. Now you can practice it all the time. Washing dishes, driving, walking. You don't have to schedule prayer time. You just have to stay awake. 3 months have passed since that first hour of prayer. Clint hasn't done another full hour since. Hasn't needed to, because the awakening that occurred in that 60 minutes hasn't worn off. It's deepened. He prays now while walking on his ranch, not saying words, just walking with awareness, noticing God in the grass under his feet, in the sky overhead, in his own breathing, in the absolute ordinary miracle of being alive. He prays while editing his thoughts. When worry arises, instead of spiraling, he notices it, acknowledges it, asks God about it, not in words, just in awareness. And often, not always, but often the worry dissolves, not because God makes it go away, but because presence has a way of putting things in perspective. He prays during conversations now, actually listens to people instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. And he's found that listening to people with full presence feels like prayer. Maybe is prayer. Maybe seeing God in another person's face, really seeing them, is what Jesus meant by loving your neighbor. He understands now what he didn't understand before. The 1 hour prayer rule wasn't about prayer. It was about waking up, about learning to recognize the presence that had always been there, but that he'd been too busy, too loud, too distracted to notice. God hadn't spoken in that hour because God had been speaking all along. Clint had just finally gotten quiet enough to hear. Marcus was right. Prayer isn't really about saying things. That's just how it starts. Real prayer is learning to listen, learning to notice, learning to be present to presence itself. And the thing that God showed Clint in that 47th minute, the thing he'll never forget, wasn't a dramatic revelation or a spectacular vision. It was something simpler, more profound. God is here, has always been here, will always be here. Not sometimes, not in special moments, but always, in everything, every moment, every breath. You just have to stop talking long enough to notice. The 1 hour prayer rule didn't give Clint a new practice. It gave him a new way of living, a new way of seeing, a new way of being. Every moment is sacred when you're awake enough to recognize the presence in it. Every conversation is prayer when you're truly listening. Every experience is divine communication when you're aware enough to receive it. At 94, Clint Eastwood finally learned what prayer actually is. Not talking to God, but waking up to God. Not doing something spiritual, but being aware of the spirit that permeates everything. He'd spent his whole life treating prayer like a phone call, something you schedule, something you initiate, something you end. He finally understood it's more like breathing, something constant, something essential, something you can do every moment you're alive. The 1 hour taught him how to pray, but what it really taught him was how to live. Awake, aware, present to the presence that had been with him all along.